If you are starting a podcast episode, there are a few things you should never do. So, I wanted to explain to you what an intro is really about when it comes to podcasting and some of the hacks you need to really implement this year if you want to hook your audience right off the bat, okay? Because hooking your audience is going to be very important if you want to increase your listenership stats, if you're thinking about increasing your downloads, and so on and so forth. So, how important is a good podcast intro? Let's quickly talk about that because you have to understand you have millions of podcasts globally, and your goal is to actually captivate your audience right off the bat. So, basically, research has shown that podcasts lose between 20 to 35% of listeners in the first 5 minutes. Think about it. This is much higher than the drop off rate for the entire rest of the episode. 20 to 35%. That's huge. That's like one third. So the importance of having a good podcast intro is actually in the evidence. If you're not hooking your listeners in the first 5 minutes, they're not going to continue listening. Why should they in the first place? They are very busy with their lives. They are bombarded with tens or hundreds of other podcast solicitations. So they would just rather go listen to your rival. Okay, so it's important to understand that if you want to really let's say structure your hook, you got to have a certain strategy behind, and the strategy has to go with let's say your target audience. What do they like? What are they looking for? What are their pain points? What kind of situation are they having? What kind of challenge are they having that they're trying to really find solutions to, that only your podcast can really bring a solution to? Okay, so a great podcast intro should really show new listeners who you are, what your podcast is all about, and why they should listen to you in the first place. And you only have a few seconds to actually make that pitch. Okay, at the same time, your podcast intro needs to engage your existing audience. So the best podcast intros are unique to each episode and include a teaser of content from later on in the show to actually hook listeners. They often include on-brand music or sound effects. Many also have CTAs too, like calls to action. For example, this could be encouraging listeners to follow you on their preferred podcast platform. So if you think about actually a podcast intro, please never really ignore the fact that your listeners are not always those who have been with you for the last 5 years or 10 years. You might have new listeners. So the first thing you should never do is actually forget to explain who you are. You always have to explain who you are, even if you think this could sound repetitive to your existing audience. Your existing audience, if they like you, they're not going to bother they're not going to be quote unquote offended because you're spending 15 seconds reminding them who you really are. So when I speak about when I'm talking to you about telling them who you are, you got to really talk about two things. What is the podcast and who is it for? And you have to introduce the host, guest, or some credentials if you think they are adding value to the overall conversation. Don't actually introduce the credentials because you're trying to show off. No, you are introducing credentials if those credentials actually elevate the value of the podcast episode you're actually bringing forward. So when I speak about what is the podcast and who is it for, basically the host will give a brief explanation of what the podcast is all about, and also will continue by giving an intriguing introduction to the episode to actually hook the audience. Okay, you also want to, but the thing is, the reason why you want to introduce the host, the guest, or the credentials is because you want to demonstrate expertise and experience in what you or your guests are talking about in your podcast intro. Okay, you want to really add an extra incentive for your audience to continue listening. Remember, the whole idea is to have your audience continue listening. They have to continue listening, okay? So you want to set the tone with music and sound effects, very important. And so basically, the backing tracks are on brand with the show's personality and match what the host is saying. And the music is slower and dramatic during the episode teaser, upbeat and also inspiring during the description of the podcast. You also want to keep it short. Please don't really have let's say a kilometric sort of intro. It is an intro. It's called introduction. So be very brief, less than 1 minute is totally fine. And also include a CTA. Okay, you want to really include a CTA in the intro. That's really important. So the second thing you should never do. So the first thing you should never do at the beginning of a podcast is to forget to mention who you really are and what the podcast is really for. The second thing you should never do at the beginning of a podcast is to actually forget about a podcast. Let's say a script for your intro, a script for your summary, but also a script for your outro. And you want to have a script because you want to structure the podcast. If you don't have a transcript, you'll be talking blah 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 and just not really being on point. Okay, so you want to have a talking point. You want to have a series of talking points, not because you just want to read, but you just want to really structure your thoughts. Okay, so you can talk about how long your podcast intro should be, and what music to use for your podcast intro, and where to find it, and how to optimize your CTA. That's an important element. So basically, what should you include in your podcast intro script? I think I've said this before, but I want to insist on the fact that basically you want to show why listeners should really tune in. That's an important element for you. If you want to hook your audience, you need to show why listeners should tune in. Maybe you are really informing them of a new development in the industry, of a new technique to solve a problem that has been around for 10 years, or you have a fantastic a fantastic guest. Okay, if you have a fantastic guest that's really unique in the industry and everybody wants to really listen to him or her, then that's a good idea. What I want to say here is that when it comes to introducing your guest, you have to understand that your audience wants to hear from them, but also they have their audiences too. I mean, maybe your guests have a larger followership than you, and they are going to really talk about your podcast to their audiences too, and their audiences are going to come to check you out. So this is a win-win situation. If you have a proper relationship with your guest and you respect them and you value them, they're going to value too. It goes both ways. Okay, that's an important element to think about. The third thing you should never do at the beginning of a podcast is to have a very long intro. I mean, I don't care what niche you're in. I don't care how wonderful you think your podcast episode is going to be. Don't have a kilometric introduction. Even Joe Rogan, in the Joe Rogan experience, a 3 hour to 4 hour podcast, he doesn't have a long intro. His intro is less than 1 minute, even though the podcast itself is 3 to 4 hours long. Okay, those are long, deep conversations because he knows the value of a short intro. Again, it's called an introduction. Okay, the whole idea is to hook the audience in the first minute, not to really tell them about. It's not about an intro. Is not about storytelling. Okay, so don't actually have very long intro at all. Okay, and what I want to say here is that even though your podcast intro should be very short, don't make it too short either. I mean, 10 seconds, that's not a lot of time for your audience to really immerse themselves, okay, into the podcast. The whole idea here is storytelling, but storytelling in a very summarized way, because you'll be doing a lot of storytelling during the podcast itself. But the intro is a great beginning to really hook your audience to know that, hey, listen, you've got good storytelling happening in the podcast itself. Okay, so if you think about the average podcast being 1 hour, 30 minutes to 1 hour long, if you spend 30 seconds to 45 seconds in the intro, that's kind of cool. And please don't forget about don't forget about having graphics, having visuals. Okay, so visuals can include photos, can include infographics, can include CTAs, can include videos too. So they say that a picture actually can speak for can actually represent 1,000 words, whatever the quote really is. I don't remember right now, but the bottom line is you want to have your intro as short as possible. So those are the three things you should never do at the beginning of a podcast. Long intro, not talk about yourself, but also not talk about the guest. Okay. So let me talk to you about the music you should use for your podcast intro. The thing is that not all podcast intros include music. That's for sure, right? Maybe yours does not need actually a uh, a musical component, but having a great track or sound effects that are consistent with your podcast's personality is actually, when you think about it, is actually a great way to hook listeners and set the tone for what's to come. Remember, when it comes to podcasting, sometimes people drive home, they are in their car, and they just listen to your podcast, or they are in the subway, they are just they have their headphones on and they just listen to your podcast, or they are at a party, at a barring party, and they do not want to be bothered, and they're just putting their headphones on to listen to your podcast. So you want to really make the whole experience for them very interesting. Okay, so basically you want to tailor the music and sound effects in your podcast intro, to the content of each episode, so you can really hook the listeners real fast. Okay, because this ad, this adaptation really helps listeners feel that they are in the destination talked about in that particular show. Okay, and so when using music or sound effects in your intro, remember that they should complement your podcast instead of overshadowing it. Okay, so make sure your added sound fits your brand and sets the mood, is very powerful, and doesn't distract from what you're saying. Right? It has to fit it in there nicely. So in terms of fitting your brand and setting the tone, setting the mood, music and sound effects should keep the same tone and personality as the rest of your podcast. It has to be powerful too. So if using a song, use the middle of a track instead of the slow build up at the beginning. Remember that memorable jingles are a great way to stay in your listener's head. And also, the music shouldn't be too loud. Edit the music so listeners can hear your words. So if you are thinking about adding music to your podcast intro this year, you have to really understand that there are a lot of places, and you got to really ask yourself, how are you willing to invest in music? Are you willing to, let's say, pay for music, because you do have a relative free music out there, but you also have music that you have to pay for, and you can pay for it on a subscription basis. So the main thing to bear in mind when looking for music for your podcast intro is that it's copyright free. You don't want to risk any legal battles for using someone else's song, right? That's something you do not want to have, because you might be thinking, well, I have a small podcast now, but if your podcast grows, like God forbid, if the podcast grows tomorrow and somebody's really trying to really file a lawsuit on that podcast, hmm, things might be really hard. Okay, I mean, if you have 1,000 followers, it's not the same calculus than if you have 1 million followers. But the whole idea here is to go for copyright free songs. Okay, let me give you a couple of the most popular platforms to find royalty free or Creative Commons licensed music for your podcast intro. The thing is that when it comes to music, especially at the beginning of a podcast, you do have a lot of options. There are plenty of free sound libraries out there, which is a great strategy, because if you're starting your podcast on a budget, you do not want to really spend too much money. However, for an established podcast, investing in a paid subscription to one of the platforms I'll be sharing with you is often well worth it. So you have free repositories such as YouTube Audio Library, you have Pixabay, and you also have the free music archive. Those are really cool. For paid, you have Soundstripe, you have Epidemic Sound, you have Audio Blocks, you have Art Lists. Now, alternatively, you could pay someone to make music specifically for your podcast. You will find many different people with the skills to write music or create sound effects tailored to your podcast intro on freelancing platforms like Fiverr or Upwork or freelancer.com. So basically, if you're thinking about having a podcast intro, you also need to think about the CTA, the call to action. Specifically, you want to think about optimizing your podcast intro CTA. Okay, so and this is important because the CTA is going to guide your audience towards the action you want them to take. Remember that basically folks have less than 5 minutes to judge whether or not they should be spending the next 30 minutes or 1 hour listening to your podcast, and you are losing 20 to 30% in the first 5 minutes. That's a lot. So basically, adding a call to action to your podcast intros is not essential, but it is actually a good way to remind listeners to follow your show or to sign up with your sponsors, especially if you know that you are going to lose up to 35% after a few minutes. Okay. So, having said that, it's also important to optimize the call to action in your podcast intro to make sure a couple of things happen. First of all, you want to make it short and snappy. If you do not want to have the CTA put the listeners off, you want to make it short and snappy. Don't really make it too complicated, kilometric, too long. No, very short. The CTA should not be the main feature of your podcast intro. It should be an added extra that doesn't distract your listeners from the rest of the episode. So you want to make it worthwhile for the listener. Okay, so for instance, if asking them to follow or subscribe, explain that this will allow them to easily find your podcast to listen to again, instead of saying that you want to boost your podcast chart stats, for instance. Okay, so it's important to also remember that it's not just about asking stuff in the intro. It's about what value are you adding to your listeners' lives. Basically, every listener who's tuning in into your show has pain points, has problems he or she is trying to solve. And so if your podcast is the destination for that problem being solved, they are going to take action automatically. They're going to take action, let's say, naturally. You don't have to really remind them to take action. They'll take the action right away. So focus, instead of focusing on having a shiny or showy CTA in your podcast intro, think about the value you are bringing to the table. Think about the value you are giving to the listener. Think about how you are helping the listener actually improve his or her life. If you can do a good job at that, chances are you are going to have a listener for life. So in today's conversation, I share with you, in closing, I share with you three things you should never do at the beginning of a podcast. And I hope the conversation was interesting and enriching to you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.